A promise was made, the prophets of old. From David's throne, a Savior foretold. The Word became flesh, God's only Son. Light of the world, the righteous one.
Okay, so continuing on, Doctrine of God, talking about does God exist? Stealing all of our information from True You. Got to give credit, Dr. Stephen Meyer. Looking at these competing worldviews. Theism, deism, naturalism, pantheism. And so far, we've kind of knocked off pantheism and naturalism off the list in some category, but we're still looking at more information. And today, we're going to look at DNA. Right, so last couple weeks, we've looked outward. Right? We looked at the heavens, the formation of the universe and the design in nature, at the big systems and the way things work in the world. And we've seen that there is definitely the hand of God, that there had to be a beginning. And if there's a beginning, there has to be a beginner. Right? And so we saw that. Well, now we're going to turn not through the telescope, but through the microscope and look at how God, his handprints, his fingerprints are there as well. And if you're going to go in the microscope, you're talking about biology. And in biology, whenever it comes to design, there's basically two arguments. There's intelligent design, that things look designed because, well, they are. And then there is Darwinism. Charlie Darwin, back in the 1800s, came up with the idea of evolution, and his thing is that things look designed, but they're really not. It's an illusion. And you get people like Richard Dawkins. Richard Dawkins, he's kind of fading out of popularity, but he's a British evolutionary biologist, has wrote several books that were wildly popular. But he says that biology is the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. The appearance. They look like they're designed, but they're not really. Because Richard Dawkins believes, as Darwin taught, in evolution, that there's this natural selection. And natural selection is an undirected process that mimics the appearance of design. It copies it. It kind of fools you into thinking things were designed. And here's kind of how that would work. Let's say it's a really cold climate, like up north in the Midwest, or maybe up in like Scotland or something, where winters get really cold. And the sheep there are really, really woolly. Lots of thick wool. And you think, wow, it's like God designed them to live in a cold climate. Some people might think that. Well, Darwin comes along and says, no, what happened was, as the sheep migrated into the cold climate, all the ones with the woolly, really thick wool survived, and the ones without the thick wool died off. And so therefore, the sheep that are in the cold climate have wool because they were naturally selected by the environment and by their characteristics to survive there. So they weren't designed for the cold climate. They just happened to survive there. And so that is what natural selection would say. And so what evolutionists would say is, yeah, that's not design. That's just, it might look that way, but just because they were naturally selected for that. And so that would kind of be how that gets explained. Francisco Ayala, past president of, I forget what those letters mean, AAAS, some science organization. He says, the functional design of organisms and their features would therefore seem to argue for the existence of a designer. It was Darwin's greatest accomplishment to show that the directive organization of living beings can be explained as the result of a natural process, natural selection, without any need to resort to a creator other than an external agent or other external agents. So again, here's a scientist saying, hey, look, it looks designed, but there's really these natural explanations. There's no need to look outside of nature to a supernatural creator. So why are they so adamant that design is an illusion? Why would they just know there is no design, there is no design? Right? Because if you have no design, what do you not have? Right? A designer. Right? A creator. If there's no design, there's no designer. Right? So there's no God. No design, that means there would need to be a designer, which means you don't need God. There's no God. No design. Well, there's two parts to the evolution theory. There's biological evolution. And this is, like I said, like with the sheep example, how you get these different varieties of creatures. It explains how you get from the simple pre-existing forms, amoeba, bacteria, the single cell things, up to everything else you see. The plants, the animals, the fish, the birds, us, reptiles, everything. Dogs, cats. Evolution claims that here's how you get this about. This is the tree of life diagram Charles Darwin was kind of famous for. The tops there, that would be like all the existing modern day, present day animals. And according to evolution, they all trace their ancestry back to, at the very beginning, bottom of that trunk, the very basic, first, simple, single-celled organisms that emerged. Now, Darwin never tried to explain where life came from. He just, his theory talks about how life that got diverse, from what already existed. And evolutionists will be quick to point that out. If you try to argue anything else, like, oh, no, evolution is just why it's so diverse. But really, if you can't get the first life to begin with, you can't really get evolution off the ground. And so there's what's called chemical evolution. And this explains how you get the very first cell. Way back, supposedly, all those billions of years ago in the primordial soup, right? You hear that word? Where back in the early Earth, where it was supposedly just all real basic chemicals floating around. And chemical evolution shows how you get that first down there at the trunk, at the bottom, how that comes about. And so if you can't figure out the chemical evolution of how life even began, well then how do you know how it all got diverse? It's all really one theory. Well, see, what happened is evolutionists, they said, okay, well, we have to figure out where this came from. Well, let's take Darwin's ideas and apply them to chemicals. And they thought, well, maybe the chemicals kind of had this natural selection and certain chemicals joined together and they functioned better, and then so they developed into cells. Well, that was easy for them to think back then. Because as T.H. Huxley said, the cell is a simple, homogeneous globule of plasm. Back then, they thought that the cell, all these trillions of cells that make up your body and everything else, they thought that those were just these really basic, like, microscopic, but they're just like really simple chemical blobs of like jelly, basically. Not much to them. So it'd be really easy for just some chemicals to come together and form. Of course, as we started to get better and better microscopes, we started seeing there's a little more to the cell than they originally thought. And so we figured out, hey, you have this nucleus, and we got this thing in there, DNA, and we have all these other little parts that are kind of doing something. So they're not quite as simple as we thought. And so they came up with, this guy Oparin came up with a theory, and I'm not going to get too crazy about that, but he said, okay, so there's these early chemicals, gases and just different basic chemicals, and in the early Earth, you had the sun radiation beating down on them. Maybe there was, thunder or lightning from thunderstorms striking things, and so you get the energy from the radiation and the lightning acting on these chemicals, and voila, you get what's called amino acids. That's going to be one of the big words we kind of need to stick in our head. Amino acids. Those are the building blocks. They're little molecules. Okay, you have atoms, and then you have molecules, and then the molecules form things in the cells. And amino acids are kind of like the building block molecules of the cell. And so the question is, well, how do we get these building blocks? And they said, oh, well, this energy striking at these chemicals formed amino acids. And then the amino acids form these chains of molecules called proteins. And those proteins perform different functions in the cell. Well, they needed to test the theory. So this guy, Stanley Miller, he came along and he basically said, okay, what we think the early Earth was like, and he tried to simulate those conditions. And he did it up because apparently the Earth was really, really hot billions of years ago, and he had the electricity hooked up to it, shocking it so to kind of simulate the energy from the sun or the electricity from the lightning or whatever. And lo and behold, he got some amino acids that formed in his little experiment. And so it was heralded, yay, looky there, we have kind of gone halfway. Like half the theory's already proven we can develop amino acids, we know how it was done. Well, one of the problems that later kind of came about that I don't hear much about is the fact that scientists now think that Miller's experiment did not represent early Earth, that wasn't the conditions, that the conditions they now think wouldn't have worked, but they still think that somehow this sort of thing worked out. Okay, fine. Let's even say that this was correct, that he pulled this off and that works. The big problem they're going to run into is proteins. Remember I told you amino acids, there's little molecules, but they form these chains of molecules called proteins. And proteins are what functions. So this little step right here is where they're going to run into a problem. Because amino acids have to line up in a very specific, very particular way in order for the protein to function. A protein is like a tool, right? It's a tool that does something inside the cell. So if you were to think about like, I have a screwdriver at home. I tried to find it. I couldn't bring it because I couldn't find it. It has the handle, but then there's different attachments you can put in the handle. So you have to put in the right kind of shaft, and then you put in the bit into the shaft. Well, if you got that rearranged backwards, is it going to drive screws very well? No, because it's not going to work. If you had a saw that got put together wrong to where the teeth were on the top, and have you ever done that, like replacing your blade on your hacksaw and you're not paying attention, you put the blade upside down? Is that going to cut very well? No, it's not. Why? Because it's in the wrong position. It's in the wrong order. It's the same way with amino acids. Here's an example. You have, this is breaking down a type of sugar. Disaccharide, I guess is what that would be. It's a sugar molecule. There's two of them stuck together. It looks like that little dumbbell thing right there. Well, in order for this to get broken apart, it fits very, very specifically into these grooves on this enzyme that then breaks it apart, and then you have two single molecules. Well, how does that work? That groove has to be very, very, very specific. If that's not put together just exactly the right way, that sugar molecule will not fit and it won't work. And so what we have is that you have to have a specific sequence. The order of the amino acids has to be exactly right. If you get them out of order, it's not going to work. Just like my screwdriver, just like the saw. If your tools are not built correctly, they will not function. And proteins are exactly the same way. The sequence of amino acids has to be right. Now, a protein has hundreds of these amino acids. So you have to have hundreds of these things in exactly the right sequence, and it kind of bends and shapes depending on the sequence, and then it performs its function. What is something else that you can think of that has to have a very specific order of things in order for it to work? Mother's pound cake.
You got to put everything in the right order, or it don't smell right.
There you go. Who knew cooking was that book? You had to put exactly the right. There you go. Cooking is chemistry. If you don't follow those steps,
In this order.
there you go. If you don't do it in that order. Well, how about another thing very simple? Words. Right? You ever play Scrabble? You ever sat there with 8 tiles and nothing? You have 8 letters, make a word. It doesn't work that way. They have to go in a particular order of certain ones, right? How about if you had this? Does that tell you anything? What is that? It's nothing. Right? It's gibberish. PM, exclamation point, LEHE, that doesn't matter. But if you put them in the right sequence, that one has some meaning. That one, it works. That one serves a function. The other one serves no function. So you have basically 3 features of proteins. Okay, The shape of the protein will determine its function. Okay? Or different shapes perform different functions. The folded chains form the shape, right? So as these amino acids come together, they bend and they shape and they twist to different shapes. And the precise sequence will determine how it gets folded. Right? So the order that they're in determines the shape of the tool, which determines what it's used for. Just to give you an example of some of the things that are going on in cells, this here is basically it's a battery recharging station. That down there at the bottom is a rotor, a little molecular machine. That is in cells. It turns, and as it turns, up in that top part, it creates positively charged phosphate molecules. And you have what is, I'm not even going to try to pronounce the word because I can't. It's like adenosine diphosphate. Anyway, they have 2 phosphate molecules. They need 3. In order to work, they need 3, but they've only got 2. So they go in, and when they come out, they have their 3rd one, and now they're fully charged, like a charged battery, and they go off to serve their function. And then they get spent, and then they come back and get recharged. And so here's kind of a little illustration, a little animation of this going on. This is going on in trillions of cells all over your body right now, made out of little molecules. The little spent ones come in, and off they go, fully charged little batteries to go be put to work. But if that stuff's not arranged in exactly the right position, that thing don't spin. Those things don't work. Now, what would they possibly need to have a little molecular battery to go charge? Well, because there's all kinds of machines in your cells doing functions. I like this little guy. This is called a Kennesene Protein. He's one of several different types of proteins that are basically the cargo haulers. All over our cells, there's these little microtubules, little filaments that just go all over our cells to different places. And there are proteins that do exactly that. They carry along the needed materials in our cells. Now, you think if he's not shaped just right that he's going to work? Right? Well, what if those molecules, they're on one of the legs, whatever, shaped different, he would be just walking kind of gimpy down the, it's not going to function. They have to be in exactly the right position. So how do our bodies know how to make those? What is it what is it in us that allows our cells to know how to build these things? You want to hazard a guess? What? Design. But what is it in us that tells it what to do? DNA. Right? Not just for paternity tests. Right? DNA actually is a molecule that stores information. Information in DNA directs the synthesis and the building of these different proteins. Let me see if I can get this to work. And we're going to watch a little video of how this works, how our DNA builds these proteins.
What we're going to see is how the information in DNA directs the synthesis or construction of protein.
Y'all hear that okay?
In 1957, Francis Crick first proposed that chemicals, called bases along the spine of the DNA molecule, function as alphabetic characters in a written language, or digital characters in machine code. This short animation shows how this digital information directs protein synthesis. First, a large protein complex separates the tightly wound strands of the DNA to prepare it to be copied. During this process of transcription, a protein complex called a polymerase produces a single-stranded copy of the original instructions. Here we see this copy, a messenger RNA molecule being constructed inside the polymerase. Now we see the polymerase in action from the outside as it spits out the messenger RNA transcript. Next, this RNA transcript approaches and passes through a molecular machine called the nuclear pore complex, an information recognition device that controls the flow of information in and out of the cell's nucleus. Now we see the genetic assembly instructions approaching and arriving at a two-part chemical factory called a ribosome, the site of protein synthesis. As the messenger RNA transcript passes through the ribosome, the process of translation ensues. During translation, a mechanical assembly line builds a specifically sequenced chain of amino acids in accord with the instructions of the transcript. These amino acids are transported from other parts of the cells by molecules called transfer RNAs, which link specific sequences of bases to corresponding amino acids. Sequential arrangement of the amino acid determines the type of protein constructed. When the construction of the chain is complete, it is often transported to a barrel-shaped machine that helps fold it into the precise shape required to perform its function. After the chain is folded into a protein, it is released into the outer cytoplasm to do its job in the cell.
We have cells.
Okay, so that was that's going on in your body right now, trillions of times over. The DNA has information code on it. Those letters function, it's information, and it gets copied, and then that information determines how that gets shaped. And by the way, that little animation we watched is very simplified. What's actually going on in your body is a lot more complex than what that showed. That's a simplification of how it's working. And so that's kind of just like the very basic level. You just got a crash course in molecular biology 101 of kind of how the DNA and protein thing works. But we're talking about, is there God? Does God exist? And in this case, we're talking about life, the first life. How did the very first life, the very first cell form? If evolution is saying, well, this all evolved. Okay, where did that first thing come from? How could it have formed? Well, if we're going to talk about the origin of life, we have to ask, what is it exactly that we are trying to explain the origin of? In this case, it's information. The fundamental mystery of life is the origin of information, specified information, functional information, right? Not just the jumbled letters that we saw, but actually the statement, help me, right? It serves a function. And so, just another quote by a scientist, Francis Crick. This is the guy who discovered DNA. This is the scientist who actually figured it out. And he said, whenever he said that there is information in our DNA, he said, by information, I mean the specification of the amino acid sequence in the protein. Information means here the precise determination of sequence, either of the base of the nucleic acid or the amino acid residues in the protein. So he's saying there's information, very specific information in our DNA. Richard Dawkins, we mentioned him. Not a fan of God, not a fan of religion, not a fan of design. He's the one that says there is no design, it's all an illusion. He even admits the machine code of our genes is uncannily computer-like. Apart from differences in jargon, the pages of a molecular biology journal might be interchanged with those of a computer engineering journal. He's actually said that the information contained in our DNA is the equivalent of 1,000 volumes of an Encyclopedia Britannica. Bill Gates has been quoted as saying that the information found in our DNA is like a computer program code, only more sophisticated than anything any human has ever written. So this information that we find in our DNA. Remember, this is the guy who said, biology is the study of things that give the appearance of having been designed. It appears designed. Well, that information is looking pretty sure that it was designed. So the question that we have to ask ourselves, and we'll get into next week exploring the ways that they've tried to explain this idea, is has the appearance of design been explained away by any natural process, by anything that would show that God does not exist, that a designer was not needed? But as we see, the information found in our cells at the very basic level. And I can't stress enough, we didn't spend a ton of time on it, but that DNA, the order of those molecules down your DNA is computer code. It is straight up, the experts who look at it, they say this is like computer code. It is a written language. Where does written language come from? A mind, an intelligence. It's the only place that we know of where information like that comes from. Very specific information that serves a very specific function comes from an intelligent mind. And so, looks to me like designer is absolutely necessary when you get down in the cellular level, but any...
It's even more intriguing when you realize, too, that no two DNA are the same.
Right, that no two are alike. That we are all, have
We're all programmed,
different,
but
right?
everyone.
Yeah, we're all programmed, but we're programmed different. All unique. One thing I wanted to get into, but I figured it'd just be a ton to throw at you all in one night. We'll get into it next week, is the probabilities of this happening. Because one of the things that people put forth is chance. Well, it's bound to happen, given billions of years and all this, time, it's just bound to happen just through sheer chance. We'll look at the probabilities of that. But there's one guy, his name's Frank Turek. He's an apologist, speaker, author. One example he likes to give is, if you come down and you see alphabet cereal on the table, the box is knocked over, and there's alphabet cereal spilled all over the table, and in the middle of it, it says, "Take out the trash, please." Are you going to stop and think, wow, look at that. That box fell over, and those letters just happened to spell out a phrase, right? No, you're going to think, okay, somebody put that in that order because they want to leave me a message to take out the trash, right? Because we know intelligence. We recognize the specific pattern and function of what is there in front of us. Language communicates. And what we find in our DNA is not gibberish, it is language. It is a written code, just like computer software, telling our cells what to do. And so, any other questions or thoughts? No? All right, well, we'll let that percolate for a week. And then we'll get into it a little more next week. Let's pray.
While we were sinners, Christ died for